All right. Hi, I am Todd Harrison. I am a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all and to welcome the panelists to the great event we have today. I am going to start by giving a quick overview of the premise for the exercise that we ran, that we're going to show you the results for. And then I'm going to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Seamus Daniels at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who will then introduce the rest of the panelists. So let me begin, share my screen here. We're calling this the DoD's 8% challenge. And what we did is we ran this exercise with experts that you see here and some others who are not part of the event today, where we asked them to take on the challenge that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth issued to the military services last month. In a memo to the service leaders, Hegseth asked them all to come back with cuts to their budgets totaling about $50 billion per year, so that the department could harvest those savings and reinvest them to higher priority items elsewhere in the budget. We asked our group of experts to try to do that and to see what insights they gained from it. You can see here, these are the specific budget targets by year that we gave them. And we also strictly enforced the 17 areas in Hegseth's memo that were protected from cuts. And this is notable because it included a lot of things such as many shipbuilding programs, nuclear modernization, missile defense, operational readiness, lots of other specific items. Then we asked the experts to reinvest those savings in things that they thought should be a higher priority for the department. We did not put restrictions on what they could invest in, other than they could not buy back something they had cut, because the cuts have to stick. So at the end of the exercise, everyone was trying to get as close as they could to a net change in the budget per year of $0. So this is a net zero rebalancing that we asked them all to do. And so that was the challenge that we gave the experts. It was full of restrictions. I'm sure none of them we're happy with, but this was the guidance that Hegseth gave to the services. So now I'm going to hand it over to Seamus to introduce our panel of experts.
Thanks, Todd. I'm Seamus Daniels. I'm a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where I research issues related to the defense budget, force structure, and military posture. And I'm excited to roll out the findings, the results of this exercise, and also the Defense Future Simulator itself. But I'd like to kick things off by introducing our panelists today who participate in the 8% challenge in the order that they appear on my screen. Melissa Dalton, a non-resident senior advisor at CSIS, who most recently served as Undersecretary of the Air Force. Michael O'Hanlon, the Philip Knight Chair in Defense and Strategy and Director of Research in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Elaine McCusker, Senior Fellow at AEI and former Comptroller at the Department of Defense. And Jennifer Kavanaugh, Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities. Now, in addition to our panelists joining us today, we had 5 others participate in the challenge. Benjamin Friedman, Policy Director at Defense Priorities, collaborated with Jennifer for their findings in this exercise. Zach Cooper, who's a Senior Fellow at AEI. Mark Kansian, Senior Advisor at CSIS. Mackenzie Eaglin, Senior Fellow at AEI. And also we had an anonymous congressional staffer, who we'll call Staffer Number 2, participate in the exercise as well. Now, in a few minutes, Todd is going to walk us through the results of the challenge and the decisions that all of our panelists and participants made. But I want to kick things off by asking each of you, what was your general impression of the exercise? I mean, cutting at least $50 billion from the defense budget over each of the next 4 years. Did you find it challenging? Did any of you manage to find it easy? Let's start with Jennifer and go in the reverse order of the introductions.
So Ben and I actually had no problem cutting stuff. We had more trouble reinvesting it. Like we probably could have cut much more. Like we stopped because we anticipated that reinvestment would be a harder for us. I think that comes a little bit from our approach. We came at this from like a restraint-oriented mindset that we would like to make cuts aligned with a restrained U.S. foreign policy. And from that perspective, we see lots of areas where DoD is overspending and where we could cut capabilities entirely. So in that sense, we were definitely limited by the things that we were not allowed to cut. Like there were lots of things on the list of 17 areas that are off limits that we would have liked to have taken an axe to. But for us, the biggest challenge was the reinvestment. There were some surprises though. So like I think it was surprising to us how much things like operational readiness cost. Like when we increased that, we were surprised at the cost. Expanding the production capability for missile programs and munitions, like that was also very costly. So I think we, to me at least, it was surprising, like things that I thought should be really expensive weren't, and things that I thought should be cheap ended up being quite costly. So I think that was like the surprise, and the challenge was really the reinvestment.
That's fascinating. And I think that may be a unique position among the others on this panel. Elaine, what was your experience?
Yeah, I will definitely contrast with that. I thought that the cuts were pretty difficult and that the restrictions themselves left very little decision space. And you were forced to cut things, at least in my case, that I didn't want to in order to reach that target. And I think that strict interpretation of those 17 things left so many things protected. We could talk a little bit more about things that I definitely would have cut within there. And I think it would also be interesting to see how we would do a reallocation drill with fewer restrictions. Because I think the reallocation drill is actually incredibly important. There's a lot of things that are in the DoD budget that do not produce military capability. And those were the things I went after first. And that part was easy, but that didn't get me anywhere near where I needed to be in reaching the total cut.
Thanks. Michael.
Greetings, and thanks for the chance to be part of this. It's a great exercise, and let me begin with a compliment to you and Todd and those who have been involved in creating the tool and inviting us to this exercise. And I'm largely in Elaine's camp on difficulty, although I guess the reason why it wasn't incredibly hard for me is that I did sort of start with a big picture IR theory, grand strategy perspective, and also my sense of the greatest military risk to the United States. And I do still think that China's scenarios are the most concerning, even though it's Vladimir Putin who's actually increased the risk of great power war more acutely in recent years. But I think the fact that Ukraine's fending Russia off reasonably well, and that we're probably going to inch towards some kind of a stalemate in that conflict, reduces the danger that NATO will be attacked by Russia. So I do wind up thinking that the China scenario is the most troublesome. But, and Todd, you know this very well, having spoken with me and helped me through the exercise, I have big reservations about the proposed cuts, and they were made begrudgingly, not because I favor the 8% exercise, but because I acknowledge it's policy relevant right now. So again, kudos to you for enforcing that on us. But I really do think that Bob Gates was right when he said we've got a pretty perfect track record of predicting the future in warfare since at least Vietnam. We always get it wrong. And so just to decide that China is the top priority and redirect most resources there and cut in areas like ground forces that may be relevant to Korea or Eastern Europe makes me quite queasy and uncomfortable. So I'll come back to that later. But in that sense, I didn't like it, but I fell back on theory and grand strategy to try to ease the way.
That's a really interesting take, that your decisions were strategically informed, albeit, in a limited environment, given that you had to find all of these cuts. And, strategic priorities and strategic trade-offs is one area that we'll tackle towards the end of the discussion here. But Melissa, take us home. What did you think about this?
Yeah, thanks so much, Seamus. And really, again, credit to you and Todd and the collective team on creating this opportunity for us, but more broadly, the community, to be able to see what these critical trade-offs mean from a defense strategy and budget perspective. I think the community is going to get great value out of using the tool going forward. I took a similar approach to Michael in trying to bring a strategic lens to this, recognizing the task at hand is difficult for the start of any administration to get the budget going and to provide strategic clarity that accords with the new administration's objectives. So we had to make some assumptions here in terms of the direction of travel for this particular administration. They have not yet, at least publicly, issued an interim national security strategic guidance, although that may be forthcoming. So what we have is Secretary Hegseth's message to the force that emphasizes lethality, that emphasizes homeland defense on the ground and the sky, the need to work with allies and partners to deter PRC aggression in the Indo-Pacific, and to end wars responsibly and reorient to key threats. So I tried to use that as a North Star to guide where I went in terms of some of the choices, but they were really tough to make. I chose to lean in on modernization. There's been some great progress the last number of years, but we're still behind the pacing threat of the PRC. Again, the assumption being that that's going to continue to be a point of emphasis for this administration, and strongly believe that we can't afford to cut programs that are important for modernization. And those, of course, incur huge bills across the services. So I try to protect those to the degree possible. Operational readiness was one of the areas protected in the Hegseth memo, but as we get into the conversation, I'll talk about why I actually put more money towards readiness. Pay and benefits, there are principled reasons why they need to be protected. Cost of living increasingly high in the United States for our service members, and also those are politically difficult to cut. So where does that lead you in terms of where you can assume risk? It directs you towards force structure and some of the capabilities that aren't going to hold up in a contested environment vis-a-vis the PRC. Also had to avoid trying to salami slice programs such that they're not viable or at scale to be effective. But this was a really tough undertaking, and I think we all found that to be the experience.
Thanks, Melissa. So it sounds like challenges across the board, some different for some of you, a lot of challenges cutting in most regards. But Todd, why don't you walk us through the results now?
Sure. Glad to do it. And, I'd be remiss in saying that we had all of the folks use our online defense futures simulator to make the cuts and do the rebalancing. And that's something that we've been developing and redeveloping over the past year in partnership with Seamus at CSIS and our developers at Spear AI, who have been a great partner, especially working with a really difficult customer like me. But I'll take us right in and let's look first at how everyone did in terms of reallocating the budget by military service. Now, keep in mind, all changes are relative to the PB25 baseline. That was the last budget request that DoD sent over. So all of these are changes relative to what was projected in that budget request for FY26 to FY29. So you can see that in everyone's scenario, the Army was a net bill payer. And in everyone's scenario, the Navy was a big winner. You see you're a bit more divided among the other services. In most cases, most people's scenarios, the Air Force did lose out a little bit. Not as many changes in the Space Force, with the exception of Melissa, which we'll come back to in a minute, and pretty mixed on defense-wide in terms of the overall change in the budget. Now, if you look, I'm going to go through really quickly service by service. You can see that there are some areas where there was consensus across all 8 teams. They either made the same increase in this category or the same decrease. Now, I'm only showing it at the category level. There are specific items underneath all of these, but it would be too much to go through in a 1-hour event. But you can see here the Army, there's a lot of red. A lot of people were making cuts in different parts of the Army. Where we saw consistency was everyone cut the number of combat aviation brigades, everyone cut the number of brigade combat teams, and everyone cut some of Army Special Operations Forces. At the same time, we saw all of the scenarios increase funding in Army Air and Missile Defense and Army's missiles and munitions. If you go to the Navy, you see a lot of green here because the Navy was getting a lot of a net plus up. Two areas where we saw agreement across all of the scenarios was Navy missiles and munitions, and unsurprisingly, Navy submarines. Every one scenario actually invested in an option we had to expand the submarine industrial base. So those are some of the common areas of agreement we saw across all the teams. Within the Air Force, people were a bit more all over the place. A lot of mixed results here by category. Where there was agreement was the need to increase Air Force missiles and munitions. I will say, since the award of NGAD came out today, that was one of the options under fighter attack aircraft, and folks were mixed on that option. We had two scenarios terminated the NGAD program. Two scenarios accelerated it, one delayed it by a year, and the other three made no change to it. So we can discuss that more in a bit. For the Marine Corps, there were no areas where every single team made the same choice. It was much more mixed, although all but one team did increase missile and munition funding in the Marine Corps. In the Space Force, many teams did very little in terms of increasing or decreasing the Space Force's programs. The two exceptions I will point out are Melissa and Elaine, but especially Melissa did the most in terms of adding to the Space Force's budget and programs. I would be interested to hear from her if that has something to do with the fact that she was most recently Undersecretary of the Air Force, and space was a big part of her portfolio there. And in defense-wide, we did see several areas of agreement. All of the teams increased funding for air and missile defense and missiles and munitions. The other category there under defense-wide, where everyone made some level of cuts, that is where we put options, as Elaine referenced before, things that don't necessarily affect force structure or acquisition programs directly. That's things like the DoD commissaries, the DoD K through 12 schools, DoD funded medical research, and several other areas like that, including changes to the basic allowance for housing, TRICARE, you name it. So every team did touch some of those items, but to very different extents. So Seamus, I'll hand it back over to you and we can go into some more of the details.
Thanks, Todd. I want to kick things off by asking all of you, what were the first and easiest cuts that you went to as you were kicking off the challenges you were looking for savings? Based on what Todd just said, it's pretty obvious from what we saw. The Army might have a few problems with you people, cutting BCTs, aviation brigades, special forces. But to kick it off, Jen, let's start with you. Why was the Army the bill payer for your exercise?
Well, like Michael and Melissa, Ben and I, although we maybe differ in terms of our concern about global threats, would agree that of the threats that exist, China is probably the greatest. And if the United States gets into a war, Asia is the most likely scenario. We also don't see the U.S. as having many interests in the place where ground wars are most likely. So in the Middle East, like most people coming from a restraint camp, we would like to have no U.S. forces in the Middle East, including a forward posture. So we don't see a lot of need for ground forces there. And in Europe, like the administration, we've been advocating for burden shifting, and we'd like to see Europe take on more of its own defense. So even if the U.S. continues to play a role in European defense, even in a contingency, it would be a much smaller role. So you just don't need the same number of ground forces. And so cutting force structure is sort of an easy place to start. It's also, force structure is one of the most expensive things, one of the biggest cost drivers, because it comes with all the personnel costs. So that was like an easy place to start. Similarly with the special forces, like a lot of the things that special forces do aren't things that as restrainers we want to see the United States involved in. We don't see them as strategically valuable. So like training of foreign militaries, at least in my research, that it never really works. So I would like to not be involved in that. So cutting things like SFABs and the special forces allocated to those tasks was fairly easy for us. And if you're going to cut the force structure, then you also can cut the equipment, right? You need fewer vehicles and maybe less modernization on the Army side if you're not going to be investing in Army forces. That said, you don't want to cut everything. Like, you do have to hedge against risk and unexpected future events. And so there, we want to maintain at least some BCTs and some special forces for expeditionary activities, which are lighter touch and at least in our view would be more aligned with U.S. interest than big, long ground interventions.
I appreciate that you are justifying it both in terms of your strategic priorities, but also in terms of the budgetary. And I think you bring up a great point in, if you look at Army BCTs, they are expensive from the military personnel standpoint, from the operation and sustainment standpoint. So that was a quick way for a lot of participants to generate significant savings. But another common bill payer across all of the exercise was the defense-wide other account, which Todd mentioned includes commissaries, DoD schools. Elaine, what were you targeting in particular in that account?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that was the easiest place to start. Because again, if you're looking at this from a strategic perspective, going after things that are in the DoD budget that are not a core function, that do not produce military capability, for me was the best place to start. And to be clear, I am not indicating that we should do away with the commissary benefit for our members and their families and veterans. I'm saying that we don't need an annual appropriation to run those more effectively and to provide better service. And so from my perspective, we can harvest that money, $1.6 billion a year going to the commissaries, and not lose anything on that benefit. And so that was an easy place to start. And again, with the schools, I mean, Department of Defense runs really good schools, but that is not producing military capability and should be handled a different way. The environmental programs and other domestic focus programs in there, kind of the similar approach with those. And so, yeah, that was my easiest place, but it didn't actually get a ton of money. And I think there's a lot more in the DoD budget to get at some of these things. The O&M accounts in particular, huge accounts have a lot of this stuff sprinkled in there, and really couldn't get at that at all during this drill. Because again, I was one who protected readiness and actually added to readiness, which is, kind of going into those accounts. I did not want to cut the Army so much, but really had little choice for the reasons that were just stated. I mean, there were restrictions, and in order to get to these targets, the Army force structure is expensive. But I don't think that the U.S. should become a one-trick pony and put all of its focus in one region. I don't think that regions are more as applicable as they used to be. I mean, I think we have a global environment, and we need to maintain our capacity and our capability and our posture for many things. But I also think unmanned plays a role here, and the future of the unmanned systems, I mean, added a lot to that in the ad bag, whether it was land or air or undersea. I think, there's a lot to be done there, maybe in a more cost-effective way, attritable systems. So that kind of helped me feel a little bit more comfortable with what I was forced to do with the Army. But again, I would not have cut that much from the Army if there had been other ways to go. And, as far as like programs protected, I did go back and add more to those places that were protected, like unmanned and space and cyber and readiness. And I think that, we should have been able to cut the Truman. I think we should have been able to cut older bombers and the LCS. And so I think, there were some stuff in there that would have allowed for more investment in the things I think we need for the future. The other thing I did is I left some money on the table in the fit up, which I don't know if anyone else did, but my thought was that the department needs a rapid flexible response fund that I should be actually much larger than what I left on the table, but I specifically left that money on the table for that type of approach with, again, a view towards modernizing the way the DoD budget is structured overall.
Thanks, Elaine. And we'll definitely get to everyone's grievances with the 17 categories and what they would cut if they weren't exempted. But Michael and Melissa, you both emphasized that you took a strategic approach to this. Melissa, you said you were trying to channel, the policy goals as stated in what we have so far from the department. What was your approach to the cuts with this kind of strategic forethought? Let's start with Michael, and then we'll go to Melissa.
Thanks. Well, a couple of thoughts in addition to what's already been said. First of all, it's a question of which scenario worries me the most and which potential adversary. And that is a question that can change with time. 10 years ago, I wrote a book arguing against deep Army cuts when they were previously on the table. You'll remember after the so-called skimmer exercise, the Strategic Capabilities Management Review, that was a DoD effort that Ash Carter ran when deputy secretary in the aftermath of the Budget Control Act. And I said that there are a lot of scenarios I can think of that are, to me, at least as plausible as Afghanistan would have seemed in the year 2000, and therefore possible, that we shouldn't rule out, and we need flexibility. And they were everything from, handling the next pandemic, which we hadn't yet had COVID, but we had Ebola, and Ebola was contained quickly, but the next one might not be, and in fact wasn't, to the Pakistanis who were, in their great wisdom, building nuclear reactors just upwind of Karachi, suffering a Fukushima-like disaster. And admittedly, the U.S. Army is not going to want to be the first responder to that disaster, but the problem is nobody else in the world can do it because the Army is the biggest armed logistics organization on the planet. That's not the only thing that it is, and some Army friends won't take kindly to that depiction, but it's true, they can do that. So anyway, what's changed is that in the last 10 years, China's become much more capable and Russia's become much more dangerous. And so I needed to be responsive to that. And if you're forcing me to make 8% cuts, that's therefore how I have to fall back. I just did a paper this winter where I argued for a net increase in the DoD top line, not enormous, but $50 billion, and go up to that level and stay there, because I don't really feel good about these kinds of cuts. But if you don't let me have that flexibility, then I have to fall back on dealing with the most concerning scenario. And so my last point, or next to last point, would be that a lot of people worry primarily about the attempted invasion scenario, China invading Taiwan. I worry at least as much about the blockade scenario. And the problem with the blockade scenario is all the big objects that China had to protect in the invasion scenario, we have to protect in the blockade scenario, because they need to be ships getting in and out of Taiwan and keeping the economy afloat. And that's where we need almost all of our Navy. In fact, I don't think we have a big enough Navy to actually confidently win that scenario. And so I don't therefore have much luxury about reapportioning within the Navy budget, given my concern about the blockade. And because I think the blockade is also the way Chinese tend to think. I don't think the Chinese want to roll the dice with one big invasion, but I think they might be willing to just turn up the heat on Taiwan the way they already have been, but ultimately start sinking some ships or destroying some port infrastructure, doing things that don't kill a lot of people, but cause a lot of economic pain. So I have to ensure against that, and air and missile defense becomes relevant to that kind of scenario as well. A very last point, Air Force tactical combat aircraft are still important for a blockade scenario or an invasion scenario, even if their airfields are going to be at risk in many places. However, I don't think we have nearly the number of airfields in the region to really warrant quite the size tactical air force that we would have if your main concern is a Taiwan scenario. And therefore, I'm willing to cut back on Air Force fighters and short range attack in order to have money for longer range strike systems, both Air Force and Navy. So that's some of the logic of where I'm coming from. A final asterisk, and I'll stop. I take Elaine's point, and she'll be the first to acknowledge, I think, that even though schools and even commissaries do not provide direct combat power, we do have a bit of a strained, if not even a mini crisis in the all-volunteer force with recruiting and retention. And anything we do that compromises our ability to offer a good life to military families runs the risk of exacerbating that. And there's nothing more central to combat capability than the cohesion and integrity of the all-volunteer force. That's just one more way of saying, not that I'm disagreeing with Elaine, but this exercise is really hard. Even those things that look easy are not. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. And Melissa, in addition to your approach, can you walk us through what were the very last things that you had to cut to get to that $50 billion number that were the most painful for you?
Yeah, it really came down to those Army cuts, because I'll get to your question, but starting with what's most important for the priority warfight in the Indo-Pacific and what actually holds up in a contested environment. I started pulling out of the capabilities that just aren't relevant and that frankly the department has been trying to divest from for the last several budget cycles, and with the ongoing dialogue with Congress has been difficult to do. So fourth gen fighters, legacy ISR for Air Force and Navy, the C5, clear capabilities that are not going to hold up in a contested environment or be survivable. So having done that and trying to use that strategic priority lens, it was where can I get the most bang for the buck in moving the needle? And that's where it got really tough because it does lead you to force structure, which is hard to grow back overnight once you take it. And just to make the link back to cutting legacy platforms, when you do that, when you cut the fourth gen fighters, you're also losing force structure for the Air Force that could be repurposed for other things in growth areas like air defense, like counter UAS. So even in some of the quote unquote easier trade-offs, there are some really tough questions there too. But when it came to trying to find the necessary dollars to really move the needle, and particularly for FY26 in particular, it was hard to get that down to zero. I tried to start whittling on the Army, and it's tough because this assumed risk for Europe and North Korea scenarios, as Michael and others have already hit on. And it's not that we don't see threats there today in either theater that could manifest in very serious ways for US national security. This administration is taking the policy shifts that our allies need to step up to do more that could potentially offset the need for US posture in certain theaters such as Europe. But it takes time to build allied capability. It's going to take years to get to the level that would be necessary in the level of deterrence and defense. So that is risk that the United States and our allies will carry if we move forward with these reductions. But frankly, it was a bit of a box that I think we were all trying to navigate, as Elaine hit on so well, in terms of how much of the Navy was protected. It kind of forced us to look to the Army as the next big bill payer.
Yeah, and I think it's a fascinating takeaway when you look at the exercise and what you can cut, that many of you had
I think I lost Seamus's audio. All right. I
to
will
make
I
similar
will
August departure from all of you.
Oh, you cut out there for a second, Seamus. Can you go back and repeat that?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Now I think, a lot of you had to make similar choices given that the 17 exempted categories hold so much budget share. But I think we'll see actual departures in terms of what you're reinvesting those funds back in. As Todd noted, some of the obvious winners here were missiles and munitions across the board, air and missile defense, the Navy, specifically submarines. So I want to dig into some of the specific decisions that each of you made, starting with Melissa, because Todd called you out already for this, plussing up most Space Force accounts. Why?
And it's not for parochial reasons based on your roles, but frankly, given the role that the Space Force is playing and the demand signal that the Joint Force is sending the Space Force, when you look at the analysis and the threat environment, particularly in confronting the PRC, when you think about countering long-range kill chains, when you think about closing long-range kill chains for the United States and its allies, the Space Force functions as those key nodes across the kill chains that can enable the Air Force, the Navy, the entire Joint Force to be able to operate in a contested environment. And so the move to space is necessary in order to be able to be survivable and resilient. So I plussed up the accounts for counter space, for domain awareness, for missile warning, missile track, and for space launch to reflect that reality and that demand signal. Now, in the Trump administration, I think we can probably bank on that is only going to grow, given the executive order on Golden Dome emphasizes the need for additional space capability to include potentially space-based interceptors, of which several colleagues on the screen have written and opined on, so I'll leave it to them to comment further on that. But the bottom line is that the demand signal for the Space Force is only growing, and there's an expectation gap, frankly, from where they are today and where they need to be, hence the additional investment.
Thanks, Melissa. I was interested to see that another service winner for one of you was in the Marine Corps. Elaine, you plussed up most of the accounts within the Marine Corps. Can you explain your approach there?
I mean, the Marine Corps is our really versatile, adaptable force and spends its money really well for the most part. And so when I was looking at, sort of options to increase our capability for the unpredictable and also for, some of the strategic priorities in the maritime environment, the Marine Corps seemed like a logical choice to me. And, in general, my ads, I think, fell in line with where we see both our modernization opportunities and, the capabilities that we really want to head towards in the future. So, I mean, space did really well. Cyber, I kind of plussed up everything I could on cyber. Unmanned, as I already mentioned. I also increased missiles and munition production capacity sort of across the board for those types of capabilities, and then also added buying some of those, once that capacity was there. And, readiness also, but the maritime capabilities, I mean, the Navy did pretty well. And as you mentioned, so the Marine Corps kind of followed by the Space Force on where my ads fell in general.
And Jennifer, you said the reinvestment was a challenge for you. What were you excited about reinvesting in? What were kind of the final things that you were putting those extra savings back into?
The things that we reinvested in like immediately were submarines. We would have done more. Like I was disappointed that we couldn't have, more than just, I don't remember exactly what the limit was, but if there had been an option for more per year, we would have done it. The munitions, definitely we, that was mostly me. I was driving the desire to maximize the purchase of those as well as increase the production capacity. I think that's a clear lesson that comes from the war in Ukraine. Is just how much mass you need, even of the precision weapons. So we definitely did that. The drone capabilities, we invested more in that. It was one of the protected things, but we also wanted more of that. I think this idea of hellscape and the use of drones for denial-based defense, I think is really important. And in my view, I mean, I'm glad to see the Pentagon spending more money on that, but in my view, a couple thousand isn't enough. You need tens or hundreds of thousands of these. And so we really wanted to reinvest in that. And then the air defense. I think that's the other thing that just the shortage of air defense, we see it already now, how overextended our air defense capabilities are. So having more of that, both the interceptor missiles and the platforms, was something that we wanted to spend on. Once we got through those capabilities, we still had a lot more to reinvest. And, we didn't want to reinvest in a lot of the options. So, some of the things that we chose to spend it on, we did spend more money on increasing readiness, with the idea that, if we're going to have a smaller force, and we stayed away from investing in some of the more expensive new programs, because our view is what we have is probably good enough. And we don't see air superiority as necessarily the goal. So we weren't interested in investing some of the higher end Air Force capabilities. We're a little skeptical of some of the space programs. Sorry, Melissa. So we spent the money then on readiness. And that ends up being quite expensive. So that was a good way to fill the gap.
Great. Thanks. Before we shift gears here to allow Todd to talk through some of the strategic priorities, I just want to give you a very quick opportunity to talk about which of the 17 exempted categories you would cut from. So list one or two as a reminder: collaborative combat aircraft, CCA, Virginia class subs, surface ships, munitions, broadly air and missile defense, as well as border security and the audit are some of the examples of those categories. Michael, let's quickly go to you, and then we'll go around the horn.
I don't necessarily agree with Secretary Hegseth on his worldview or his diagnosis of our top problems, but I can't really complain too much about most of his 17 categories. And I guess the one I would just mention, not that it involves a lot of money, but although it involves all the money, is the audit. And let's not make that too big of a deal. The fact that DoD needs multiple audits to account for most of its money is too bad, but it's not our biggest national security problem. And fixing that is not going to be anything too big to brag about either.
Melissa?
I would reinforce Elaine's point earlier in terms of surface combatants. If you apply that lens of what is going to hold up in a contested environment, they are not survivable. So why include them on the protected list?
Okay, Elaine, you're not allowed to say surface combatants.
Yeah, because I guess I've already spilled the beans on that, as well as the Truman refuel. And I guess I really wanted to cut the old bombers because I really feel like the Air Force needs to have the money to go towards the new aircraft and the modernization and unmanned systems. And so I kind of really wanted to go after those bombers. The other stuff was the ships. So I think I actually was surprised to see the audit on the list as well, because it's not very much money. And I think that was just a signal that was being sent. I mean, I didn't find myself with a desire to go find the audit money and cut it. So, that was one area that didn't really bother me. But in general, I thought that the 17 areas, the way that we interpreted it to fence things off was just too strict. And we should have allowed ourselves a little bit more decision space. And again, give us a chance to keep more Army capacity that I think we actually need. Over.
And Jennifer, what is that? What are those top 1 to 2 categories for you, which you would have loved to kill?
Well, the large surface combatants was definitely our number one. We kept trying to cut them, and Todd kept sending us back and saying, like, you can't cut that, you can't cut that. Our solution was to, like, we couldn't cut the aircraft carriers, so we cut their fighter jets. We're like, if we can't cut the ship, we'll make them less useful. Maybe they won't use them. So that was definitely one. And then the homeland defense stuff, like, to me, that's not a military task. And I would rather military resources go to other things, and that we spend that we address the border issues through law enforcement and legal reforms.
Thanks. Todd, it sounds like you had your hands full just wrangling everyone and making sure that they adhered to the rules here.
Yeah, I was the evil Cape director, I think, where I just kept kicking people's budgets back, saying, sorry, you didn't meet guidance. And maybe we were a little overly strict in some of our interpretations, but I'll leave that to the audience to judge. It did make it more fun, though. But I'll say one of the interesting things about this exercise and the way we structured it so that it was budget neutral for everyone, it was a rebalancing, but you end up at basically the same level of overall budget, is it allows us to compare how people shifted priorities within that. So it's an apples to apples comparison. And I'll share some of the results from that. So one of the cool new features we added in DFS is a system that scores your scenario based on all the changes you make in the budget, program adds and kills and changes in force structure. It scores that in terms of the implied shift in emphasis on different strategic priorities. And so here are, what's commonly referred to as the iron triangle of painful trade-offs. And this is how everyone scored in terms of their changes. So it's interesting to see some consistency here that basically everyone sacrificed force structure for modernization and operational readiness. Now, that shouldn't be too surprising when you go through, the protected areas from Hegseth. Well, you weren't allowed to cut operational readiness funding directly. And so, of course, that's not going to go down. And you weren't allowed to cut a lot of modernization programs like air and missile defense and shipbuilding and nuclear modernization and the CCA. So there were less ways that you could make modernization go down overall. So what that left people to do was actually to cut force structure. And so that's an interesting takeaway of what we should expect to come out of the Pentagon's FY26 budget request that this exercise is intended to inform. The other thing is looking at the different strategic priorities of the military and how the rebalancing everyone was forced to do changed the emphasis on those different strategic priorities. Everyone ended up with a force that put greater emphasis on China and to a much greater extent an emphasis on nuclear deterrence. And we also saw that all 8 scenarios ended up reducing the emphasis on irregular warfare and counterterrorism and homeland and hemispheric defense. That is interesting because that was one of the priority areas for this administration, but a lot of the cuts you're forced into trying to find $50 billion in savings, you end up cutting things that would help you in homeland defense. But again, a lot of these shouldn't be too much of a surprise because the restrictions, for example, not being able to cut nuclear modernization, nuclear modernization could only go up. So of course it went up. So it really did. We saw the restrictions playing into how the strategic priorities were shifted, pretty much across the board.
Thanks, Todd. So obviously there's some winners and losers there in terms of strategic trade-offs, with modernization and operational readiness winning out over force structure. I think an interesting thing digging into all of those results is that each of the panelists today actually boosted modernization funding more than the other 4 participants not in this event. And modernization was only cut by 1 participant over the duration of the exercise. But let's start with Melissa and Elaine, because you prioritize modernization over, you were the top 2 in terms of boosting funding for modernization. Was this a deliberate choice for both of you?
Did you want to start with me?
Yes, we'll start with you.
Fantastic. Yes. Again, if the focus is on deterring the PRC, in order to do that, we need to be modernizing the joint force. So alignment with the strategic priority lens and then a bias towards modernization was a very deliberate approach that I took in terms of where to divest and where to invest. And the basis of that is that there's no other competitor that poses such a consequential challenge to the United States. It's a generational challenge, diplomatically, economically, technologically, and of course, militarily. And we're seeing that manifest in the Indo-Pacific, but also with implications for the U.S. homeland. It's been the logic of the last 2 national defense strategies, has bipartisan consensus on the Hill. We'll see how forthright this administration is in its forthcoming strategic documents on the emphasis on the PRC, and then how that manifests in its budget. I did want to make a brief note on some of the interesting trend lines that Todd mentioned on Homeland, that because of the cuts that we all chose to make, that overall saw a downtick, pretty significant actually. And I think part of that is that when we historically think about Homeland Defense, it's cued to Army and legacy aircraft, the on alert post 9/11 construct that we have for Homeland Defense. And arguably the Trump administration and the Biden administration, Trump administration before that, acknowledged that given the strategic competitor lens, we need to update our approach to Homeland. And so it'll be interesting to see as we move forward with the emphasis on Golden Dome, different ways of conceptualizing how we defend the homeland, where the balance of capabilities is going to be for Homeland Defense. Last note on that is that historically we have also defended forward when it comes to protecting the homeland. And with some of the changes afoot in terms of our potential alliance structures, The role of combatant commands globally may start changing some of that architecture that has allowed us to defend for it, that again connects to some of these budgetary choices that we're making in this exercise. Thanks.
Yeah, and I am pretty aligned with Melissa and how I looked at that and on the emphasis of modernization. And so I won't repeat all that, but I think I agree with Todd that the zero sum was incredibly useful, because without that, it would have been difficult to really do this kind of a conversation. But I think we need an overall increase in the defense top line, and the reallocation, at least in my case, without those restrictions, would not have cut force structure like that, because I think that we need to continue to balance capacity and capability, and I would not have cut the capacity the way I did if the exercise hadn't been run this way. So though I agree with everything Melissa said about the approach on modernization, it would be interesting to see how this exercise would be run with a little bit of a change in the restrictions, and also maybe even allowing everyone, maybe except Jennifer, a little bit more of a top line to see how we would kind of do this exercise that way. Over.
Michael, while you also boosted modernization funding, I found it interesting that of all the panelists, you maintained the most force structure. So you made the fewest cuts to actually, capacity. Is that inspired by what you were discussing before about actually needing that force structure to address challenges that we're seeing today, specifically with China?
Yeah, but also even with Russia, I don't want to take the logic of saying we have one preeminent potential adversary too far. And, again, historically, the United States has wound up in a lot of conflicts in a lot of places that we didn't expect. Jennifer would say that's partly because we aren't smart enough to stay out of them. And I'm sure she's right to some extent, but it's also true that we have interests all over the world. And so I do worry that if we entrust the defense of Eastern NATO territory just to the Europeans, even though it's sort of the spirit of the moment and the flavor of the month or of the current administration, Vladimir Putin may think that's a good moment to test whether Europe can really defend Eastern Latvia and Eastern Estonia. And, frankly, I'm not sure Europe can, Western Europe can. So I'm a little reluctant to start downsizing. Now, it may be more important to get, 10 Army brigades there fast rather than to have 30 in the force structure. So again, there's probably room for reprioritization and some cutting, but that's an example of a scenario that leads me to want to keep some more Army than maybe I otherwise would. Korea is also a case where South Korea has a fantastic Army, but there's so many scenarios that could involve nuclear weapons use that could put a premium on rapid conquest and our maneuver capabilities that I am hesitant to cut the Army too much in light of that potential scenario. And I already mentioned earlier some of the, asymmetric or unpredictable kinds of problems where you could just require an armed organizational structure that can sort of control a certain territory or population. Even though coin is out of flavor and we're tired of Afghanistan and Iraq, things tend to happen that we don't foresee. And the last point I would make is that I think that Melissa and Elaine made good points about Navy surface combatants being vulnerable. My dilemma is that when I look at a blockade scenario, I don't know how else to break the blockade without a lot of surface combatants. And I have to therefore hope that we can get enough into China's satellite and C4ISR capabilities that we can blind them enough, at least on the eastern side of Taiwan, to be able to operate there. Because if we can't, then I don't know how we keep Taiwan afloat. And so that scenario, which I'm sort of obsessed with and have written about and continue to think about, that pushes me towards wanting to keep platforms that may not be survivable, but without which we may not be able to deal with the most likely, or one of the most likely, China threats to Taiwan. So those are some reasons why I didn't want to cut too much force structure and why I'd really rather not cut any.
Thanks. Jennifer, you had the biggest emphasis on increasing operational readiness. To what extent was that driven by you not wanting to allocate funds to other areas within modernization or within force structure, or you also feeling that we really need to emphasize readiness? And I also want to tie it to the strategic priorities chart that we saw, that, you were obviously forced into making a lot of these cuts, a lot of the distribution where we saw that the major winners were competition with China and nuclear modernization, and less of an emphasis on actually homeland and hemispheric affairs. If you had your way with the budget and being able and not being limited by the exemptions that were made in the memo, what were the major areas where you would like to see cut and plussed up within those strategic priorities?
So on the readiness question, I think it was a little bit of both, but I mean, Ben and I really tried to do things that like made strategic sense. We weren't just like adding things because it was like the least bad option. But so in my view, like I'd like the military to be smaller. I'd like the DoD budget to be less. I'd like us to be involved in less things. But I recognize that things happen in the world that we can't predict, and we may need to respond to things that we don't plan for. And so I would like our forces to be ready to move quickly when they need to. I would like to keep things small and limited, but like if they have to go, they have to go. So that was one reason for readiness. The second is just looking at the force and like the number of like accidents that we see happen, like whether it's like training accidents or like ships crashing into each other or shooting down our own fighter jets. It makes me concerned that like the kind of forces are like overstretched, and that there's a need to focus like not on giving them more fancy equipment, but kind of back to basics. Like, are they like well trained, and are we making sure they're ready in all senses of the word ready? And so some of that is having them tasked to do fewer things, but some of it's also investing in training and other types of things that I would put under readiness. So that's sort of why we allocated that money to readiness. On the broader question, I think for the Homeland Defense piece, like I'm always trying to separate in my mind like hemispheric defense, where I put like defense of the homeland, where I'm thinking like missile defense and making sure that we have the sensing technologies to be able to detect threats to our airspace and undersea, like anti-submarine capabilities. To me, that's separate than like border defense, because right now I don't see the borders as being a major threat. To me, that's a little bit inflated. So while I'm willing to cut like the capabilities that would be needed to like have an armed force on our southern border, I'm interested in investing more in the capabilities that will allow us to defend against missile attacks, since that's to me the most likely threat against the United States. I think the big challenge that Ben and I faced is that we didn't really we didn't want to reallocate a lot of the money. Like we would have reallocated some of it, but we would like to have like a lower defense top line. So we were kind of in the opposite camp of Elaine. And so we probably would have had more significant cuts to like the Russia capabilities and probably even more significant to things like counterterrorism activities. I don't think we would have had more in the China space. I think we felt like, well, unless we could allocate more to submarines, but that's a question of sort of capacity. So I think for us, that's sort of like how we thought about the strategic priorities. Like there was really no area where we were like, damn, we wish we could allocate more, except the submarines. We wanted to do more there. Everywhere else, it was like we really enjoyed the spirit of the exercise, in the sense that it made us think about like, well, where would we reallocate this money if we have to? But in a lot of cases, we would have been perfectly content with our cuts and then kind of like a few reallocations and then walking away.
Todd, it sounds like we are going to have to run another exercise where we actually give people a bit more flexibility on this front, both to increase and decrease as they see fit.
Hey, we can do it. Absolutely.
At this point, I just want to give everyone kind of a chance to give their final thoughts on the exercise, how they found it, what they want to do going forward. Let's go Elaine, Michael, Melissa, and then wrap up with Jennifer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just final thoughts. I mean, I think this is incredibly useful. And I do think that there is, a need to do reallocation within the programs and activities in the Department of Defense. But I think that the top line is too small for what we're asking our military to do and what we should be asking our military to do, and for the strategy that we've outlined, even though I think that also needs to be updated. And I think that that's a pretty universal belief that it needs to be updated. And I think, doing another one with that more flexibility and a higher top line, the same for everyone, I think might be useful to see what we would really do. Because I think you've heard from all of us that we did things that we wouldn't do based on sort of how the scenario was run. But I still think it was incredibly valuable, and appreciate everyone's participation and Todd for the tutorial on DFS in general. And I think it's a great tool that that people should use.
I loved it as well. Congratulations. Thank you for including us. I'll just reiterate one of the points I've been trying to drive home today by saying that, bear in mind, today's US military is slightly smaller than the military of the 1990s, after we finished the post-Cold War drawdown. We basically drew down to 1.4 million active duty personnel, uniformed personnel, in the 1990s. Now we've got Russia and China to worry about, and we're at about 1.3 million active duty, plus, of course, civilians, reservists, and the whole broader defense community. So we have a lot of people working on national defense in the United States, but the active duty force is pretty small. So it does make it hard to cut force structure. And that's one of the reasons why we have this dilemma. Our budget looks already quite big, but it may not be big enough. And as a percent of GDP, it is more or less manageable. Of course, the other caveat is the debt and deficit are way too big for long-term national power to be sustainable, in my judgment. So we have to be, in my opinion, hawks, but cheap hawks, to borrow from Newt Gingrich's line of the 1990s. And I'll thank you again.
My thanks also for the opportunity to participate in this great exercise. I think it's been really illuminating to show the hard trade-offs that our DoD colleagues are having to navigate right now. Todd invoked earlier the great Kathleen Hicks iron triangle of painful trade-offs. I think front of mind is in performing this exercise and how you square the geometry of modernization, readiness, and force structure. They're immovable legs of the triangle unless you alter the geometry by changing the goalposts of national ambition, unless you find ways to find efficiencies, or you look to leverage asymmetries within the DoD system, like innovation, reform, the role of allies and partners. I think we see some potential trend lines here that could change the geometry of the iron triangle. As the Trump administration may be changing US national ambition in terms of the US military's role in the world. That does come with great risk, as we've talked about here today, in terms of Russia, Middle East, and other places around the world that historically we've cared about. But that could alter the geometry. This 8% cut and the efforts of Doge colleagues in finding efficiencies could also alter the geometry, although we don't know what the second and third order effects of those cuts and efficiencies might be. Could be up, could be down for DoD over time. And I think we'll have to see how that manifests. But there is a lot of emphasis also on innovation and reform, to include on the acquisition front. And so there may be asymmetries in the defense ecosystem that it can be leveraged, building upon good work over the last number of years happening in the services, in DIU and other places, in the labs across DoD, to help harness some of the unique ways that the United States military can bring asymmetric advantage to accomplishing its objectives. So these are ways that we might be able to change the geometry of the otherwise immovable iron triangle of painful trade-offs. Thanks very much.
Okay, so it's my turn. So, I mean, I think that, restraint has a different view of what U.S. interests are and should be. And so I think gravitates towards this idea, as Melissa described it, as like a narrower view of U.S. ambitions. And so I think that's probably why Ben and I found the cuts so much easier, because we saw a lot of the things the military was spending on as unnecessary. So, my observation, I guess, was twofold. If you're willing to go in an astrategic way and just cut stuff, there's a lot of stuff to cut. And so I think that's a risk, because like there's a drive right now to cut things and for that number to be big. But that's not necessarily the best way to do it. Because then you end up with ships with no planes, or force structure with no equipment, or equipment that has no personnel to use it. And so you can end up with imbalances really quickly. And so I think that's a risk that I realized Like, it's hard to navigate within just the software because you can't it was a little hard for me to kind of figure out like what the ratio should be, but I think that's a real challenge. And I think that anytime you're making cuts, like one thing that was always in the back of my mind is that as I can't remember who said it, but it's like once you cut stuff, it's hard to get back. Like if you retire aircraft or you get rid of 4th gen fighter jets or you cut force structure, like getting those things back is hard. You may not be able to get it back. You may need to buy more expensive things in the future. So trying to figure out like how you at least for Ben and I, like how we can move towards something that we see as a more restrained, a force structure that's aligned with a more restrained U.S. foreign policy without incurring risks that we end up regretting later is a challenge. And I think that is one concern as the current administration thinks about drawing down some commitments, that they will need to be very careful in how they do that. Like process matters. It's not just the outcome, the process matters. And the process is in those cuts. And that will require that the political appointees who have this vision of what they want in the future in terms of outcome are working really closely with the civil service and military personnel who have the like subject matter expertise to guide those trade-offs.
Well, I just want to say thanks to all of you for joining us. Thank you for participating in this exercise. I know it's been fascinating for Todd and I to see all of your findings, all of your results and recommendations in this less than flexible environment. So maybe we'll be looking for an opportunity in the future to get you back together. Todd, back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Seamus. And thank you all for participating. As we're closing up here, I just want to show this slide. We did a comparison within the Defense Future Simulator on how much each of your scenarios aligned with each other. And so, the best matches here, Jennifer and Zach Cooper, Jennifer and Ben doing it as a team, were the most aligned with our colleague here at AEI, Zach Cooper. Mike and Elaine were each most aligned with each other. Melissa was most aligned with Mike, but interesting, Melissa and Elaine, you each aligned with Mike on different things. So you didn't align as much to each other. The worst matches, I can't help but get a chuckle from this. It was Melissa and Mark Kanzian, who have worked together for probably like 8 or 9 years at CSIS. They had the most divergent scenarios. And also point out our colleague, Mackenzie Eaglin, was not very aligned with the anonymous Hill staffer number 2. I'm sure people at home are wondering, what about Hill staffer number 1? And there also was a number 3. Number 1 and number 3 did not finish their scenarios in time. So they effectively passed a full year CR and then adjourned to their home district. But if those of you watching at home are interested in trying this yourself, DFS is publicly available. It's up on the web here at defensefutures.aei.org. You can go there. You can create an account. Anyone can create an account. And once you get in, you can start creating your own scenarios. You can set your strategic preferences to see where you would like to go, what your targets are, just by moving the sliders that you see here on this page. And then when you go to the item selections, you can go through all the same items that the experts here had to choose from. The tool will do the math for you in the background, accounting for acquisition cost, operation and maintenance cost, personnel cost, all of that. It keeps track of your key force structure metrics, everything from total number of aircraft in the fleet to Navy ship tonnage and the number of vertical launch system cells within the Navy fleet. And once you've made all your choices, you can go back to that strategic preferences page. You can see how it scores your choices in terms of each of those strategic priorities. And you can run various reports to see the choices you've made. And of course, you can share the scenarios that you make in DFS with other users. So if you are interested in this, go sign up. You can run your own scenarios. if you go to the team section, you can request to join the 8% challenge team, and I will send you the same instructions that we gave to the experts here, so you can try your hand at doing the same rebalancing exercise. I would say stay tuned. We're continuing to add new features to the tool in the coming weeks. And when the PB26 budget request actually comes out, we will update that data as a new baseline in DFS, and we can all begin playing with it again. Thank you all for joining us. I know we've run over time a little bit here today, but thank you for joining us. And as always, stay in touch. And thank you to all of the panelists as well. Have a good afternoon and a good weekend.